And I think you guys now see something to give me permission to record. Do you guys get a little pop-up when I just did that? This evening, I'm going to create for us and just us our very own YouTube channel. And each class that we record, I'll put that class recording in our YouTube channel. So when we come back together tomorrow morning, I'll give you the link to our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and review something, if you said, gosh, what was it that Julie was talking about? You have the whole class starting right now recorded, so you can go back and review it, especially with the math. You may want to use the recording to go back through the math at your own pace. So tomorrow morning, I'll give you our YouTube channel after I create it this evening. And each time we have a class, I'll just drop it in there so you guys will have access to that. Did I cover everything? Questions or comments? Everybody feeling good? Doing good so far? Good, 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 good. Okay. So why are we here? Well, other than the Real Estate Commission says that we have to be, why does the Real Estate Commission make us be here? The whole purpose of post-licensing is to increase the provisional broker's competency in regards with sufficient knowledge and skills to help when you're working with the public. You guys may remember from pre-licensing, the Real Estate Commission's main purpose is to protect the public. And one way they protect the public is by issuing and regulating our real estate license. If we are found to have harmed the Real Estate Commission's public, then that's when they discipline our license. The Real Estate Commission is not going to fine you. They're not going to impose a fine on you. They're going to discipline your license if you harm their public. And one way they want to better protect the public is to help educate us, which is why post-licensing. Robert and Penelope, this is your third post-licensing, so you guys know. 301 is an extension of agency. They took what you learned in pre-licensing and agency and they expanded on it. 302 is an extension you're getting ready to learn, an extension of contracts and closings. So we're going to take contract and we're going to take the closing process and we're going to expand on them a little bit more. And then 303 is law and rule. So they're going to take license, law, and commission rule. Good times, I know. They're going to take license, law, and commission rule and expand on that a little more. So your three major topics of pre-licensing have become post-licensing topics. They gave you just enough to be dangerous in pre-licensing. And now that you've crossed that hurdle and you're here with a license, they say, okay, we need to fine-tune these skills. We need to make sure that they have a good understanding of agency, of contracts, and of license, law, and commission rule. So that's what the 90 additional hours of post-licensing are for. So we're going to start chapter 10 in your post-licensing manual, whether you have the book or the digital. I don't have page numbers on the digital. So if you're on the digital, you can search. The digital is actually it's pretty intuitive. It's pretty interactive. You can highlight stuff. You can make notes. It's kind of cool. But chapter 10 is what I call our big review on contract law. So it's been a minute since you took pre-licensing and you don't remember things about basic contract law, that's what we're doing in chapter 10. And in this chapter, we're going to define some basic contract terms. We're going to discuss the essential elements of a contract. We're going to discuss contract law. So we're going to go through the basics. We're going to refresh on how a contract is formed. We're going to talk about how contracts work. Guys, remember, unless you are, we are not attorneys. Is anybody an attorney? All right, that I can say, we are not attorneys. So we don't need to act like attorneys. The reason that we study basic contract law is because we work with these things every day. And we need to have a basic understanding of how contracts are formed, of how they can terminate, how they end. So this doesn't give us, this chapter 10 does not give us the golden ticket to run around acting like an attorney giving legal advice. This is for us to aid us through our day-to-day operations when dealing with contracts. And just to point out, for those of you that like to follow along in the book, my PowerPoint's on the bottom right. I have the page number. So if you want to follow along, if you want to use the PowerPoints to help direct you in the book, you have that information there. When we talk about contract law, we need to first define what a contract is. Make sure that we have the basic definition of a contract. And a contract is just a deliberate agreement between two or more competent parties supported by legal consideration to perform or abstain from performing some act. It's a legally enforceable agreement between two parties. Two parties have voluntarily agreed to enter into an agreement together, and the contract, the written contract, binds them. Big picture of contract law applies to not only our standard offer to purchase and contract, but it applies to our leases, our agency agreements. Those types of contracts fall under the basic category of contract law. This class focuses, the star of this class is the offer to purchase and contract. So when we look at that, we're going through that sucker word for word, all 15 pages of it. That's what you have to look forward to next Saturday. But it's important that we understand what those words are. And it's important that we understand what those words mean. Contracts can be either express or implied. Please understand, express contracts, they're mostly in writing, but they can be oral as well. Express contracts, they're expressed because the terms have been clearly stated. They're expressed because the terms have been spelled out. They've said, this is what it looks like. This is what's going to happen. Now, most of the contracts that we do in real estate are required to be in writing. But understand, when talking basic contract law, and you're talking about an express contract, it could be an oral. The problem with oral, as we're going to learn in just a minute, is it's not enforceable. You can enter into an oral agreement with somebody. You can shake somebody's hand and say, yeah, I'll buy your house. The problem is that's not going to stand up in a court of law. So we require in real estate, our contracts, our express contracts, to be in writing. So if we ever have to go stand in front of a judge, it'll stand up in a court of law. Compare express contracts to implied contracts. Implied contracts are suggested from the actions. Based on your actions, I could just start acting like your agent, excuse me. I could just start acting like your agent. That would be an applied agreement. Implied is not going to stand up in a court of law. It's unenforceable. So what we're looking for in real estate is express in writing. Contracts can be unilateral or bilateral. Lateral in contract law means side. So a unilateral contract is one side. A bilateral contract is two sides. Practically everything we do, I got one exception, but everything else that we do is a bilateral contract. There's two sides. Two parties have promises and obligations and duties to each other. The example in real estate that we have for unilateral contract is our option to purchase. We're going to talk about our option to purchase, I think, in chapter 11. So we'll talk more about that. We'll revisit that. Everything else we do is bilateral. It's a two-way street. Both parties have duties and obligations to each other. Contracts can be executed or executory. An executed contract is fully performed. all the terms have been fulfilled, all the promises have been made, it's a done deal. An executory contract is a contract still in motion. We haven't fully performed yet. We're working towards it, but we haven't fully performed yet. Our contract to closing process is an executory contract. It's still in motion. There's still terms left to be done. We will talk about our contract to closing process today, actually. We'll start talking about that today. Real estate likes to keep you on your toes. Could you guys agree with that so far? What little bit you know, we like to keep you on your toes and make sure you're paying attention. So to keep things fun, executed has two meanings. Executed could refer to a fully performed contract. Executed could also mean that the contract has been signed. You got to use your context clues. Let's put yourself in a scenario. You and the other agent, the other side, are negotiating the deal. The other agent calls you and says, my guys have executed the contract. When you're negotiating and they call you and say they've executed, you know it hasn't closed. You still got like 4 to 6 more weeks, 8 more weeks, right, before it closes. When they call you and tell you that their guys have executed the contract, executed the offer, what they're saying is that it's been signed. So we can execute it when we go under contract, i.e. sign it. It's executory in the contract to closing process. And then once it's done, the very last act of recording the buyer's brand new deed, it's executed, again, in this term, meaning that it's been fully performed. I didn't get this at first when I first got into sales. And agents would call me and say, our contract's executed. And I get so upset, like, no, it's not. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, as it come to find out, I was the one that didn't know what I was talking about. We live and we learn, don't we? Questions or comments on that?
Yes, ma'am. I got a question, Ms. Julie.
Of course.
While we're on that topic, once the contract is signed, it still has to be delivered, correct?
Yes. Yes. And when I called you and said my guys have executed, that was me delivering it. Absolutely. And we're going to refresh that magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract. We're going to refresh that in just a bit. Absolutely. Thank you. Good question. While we're still in this section, kind of defining words, I need to go off the textbook for just a minute, because we need to talk about a couple words that we're going to see a lot, especially in this class. So I want to go off book and make sure that we're good. We're going to talk about addenda. We're also going to talk about an amendment. Several in this class. This is a forms class, by the way. When you guys see the word addenda, I want you to see the word add. An addenda adds to and becomes part of the offer to purchase and contract. It becomes part of that legally binding promise. It's a provision. Think about an addenda. It's an added provision. We're going to look at lots of examples of addenda. An amendment is a change to an already existing agreement. We're under contract. We've shaken hands. We signed. Congratulations, you're under contract. For whatever reason, we agree to change some of our agreed upon terms. And when we're changing our agreed upon terms, we're amending our original agreement. So an addenda is an addition, an amendment is a change. I got forms for both. We're going to look at sample addenda. We're going to look at sample amendments. We got forms for both in this class. So we're going to talk about the validity of contracts. When we talk about the validity of contracts, what we're referring to is how will this contract stand up in a court of law? If we have to take, or the parties have to take this contract to a judge, what is the judge going to look for to determine if it's enforceable? Guys, it's not my job to determine if it's valid. It's not my job to determine if it's not. Everybody hear me? Because I'm not a judge. But we, again, have that basic understanding of how these things work. Ultimately, what the judge is looking for is a valid contract. A valid contract satisfies all of the legal elements of a contract. We will talk about those elements in just a bit. A valid contract is binding and fully enforceable in a court of law. If either party takes a valid contract to a judge and says, I want to get out of it, the judge is going to say, why? The contract itself is fine. A valid contract is fully enforceable. It will stand up in front of a judge. That valid contract, the judge could decide to make it voidable. The valid contract can become voidable if the judge determines that that's the case. The contract itself is still valid, so it has all the essential elements. What makes it voidable is the right of one of the parties, just one. One of the parties may have a right to say, because of whatever reason we'll talk about in just a second, because of this reason, I shouldn't be expected to carry through with the terms of this contract. The judge may say, well, the contract itself is valid. It has all the essential elements. But because, for example, you're a minor, if you're under 18, you can't force somebody to carry through with the terms of a valid contract. In that case, the judge may make the contract voidable. This is what's interesting about voidable contracts. What if that minor never goes to a judge? What if that minor doesn't take that valid contract to a judge and say, I don't have to carry through the terms? Remember, the contract is still valid. So unless we take that contract to a judge to declare it voidable, the parties can still complete it voluntarily because the contract itself is perfectly valid. Everybody hear what I'm saying? Contract is valid. It can become voidable by one of the parties. So we said some examples of the people, the person that could make it voidable. A judge cannot force a minor to follow through with a legally binding contract. If it can be proven that somebody entered into the contract and they were under the influence, legal and illegal substances, the judge may make it voidable. And if it's found that either party didn't have mutual consent, they didn't voluntarily enter into the contract, the judge may decide to make it voidable. We've got some more examples of voidable that we'll talk about in this chapter in just a bit. Do I have any questions on that? Valid contract can become voidable because of one of the parties has the right. Okay. A void contract has no legal force. A void contract is unenforceable in a court of law. It's void because it's missing one or more of the essential elements, again, that we're getting ready to talk about in just a second. Again, the judge is the one that makes it void. So if neither party take this contract to the judge and say, one of these essential elements is missing, both parties can still complete it voluntarily. The judge declares that it's void. And again, what the judge is looking for, those essential elements. Does it have the required ingredients that it needs to form a valid contract? So in theory, a void contract, you never had a contract to begin with. You take it to a judge, the judge says, well, it's missing one of the essential elements. Essential element says you have to have these to create a contract. The judge may make it void. Again, understand, a contract that is legally void is not automatically void. It doesn't just happen, the judge has to declare it void. Some examples of a void contract. You can't have a legally binding contract for an illegal act. Doesn't that make sense? All of our contracts, legally binding contracts, have to be for legal purposes. Any contracts with discriminatory practices will make the contract void. Forgery. Or if the party's been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. If the courts decide that the individual doesn't have the mental capacity to enter into a contract, then the court could make that void. Please note, just kind of an FYI, make sure we're all good. If somebody has been declared mentally incompetent by the medical profession, but not by the judge yet, if somebody has been declared mentally incompetent, that may make the contract voidable. Mentally incompetent may make it voidable. Mentally incompetent by a court of law may make it void. So the difference is whether or not the courts have weighed in on that or not. Questions on that? Questions on our contract validity?
Hey, Julie, quick question.
Sure.
At the top of page 295, there's an example of forgery, and it
Mhm.
appears that it is not considered a forgery, or at least voidable, if somebody signs on behalf of a friend when he or she has knowledge of the signature / forgery.
And that's what would make it void. Yeah, that's what would make it void. So if I said, Arion, go to closing for me and sign this document, and it was later found out that you signed my name, right? Then
With my
that could
knowledge.
make that, is that not what you're asking? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, with my knowledge.
You're right. Either way, I can't sign for you with or without your knowledge, right? Unless you give me full power of attorney. That would be the only way that we could avoid making that an issue. You give me full power of attorney to sign on your behalf. But if I just go sign your name for the sake of signing your name, then that's not going to stand up.
Thank you.
When the judge finds out. That's the key, guys. The judge isn't going to show up to closing and say, let me make sure you're you. That's the key with these. We got to take it to the judge. So you find out later, I sign on your behalf, even with your knowledge. If I don't have full power of attorney, and if you verbally told me to go do this for you, we have an oral agreement, right? And an oral agreement isn't going to stand up in a court of law. Think about going to judge with an oral agreement. Well, he said I could. He said it would be all right. And Arion says, no, I didn't. I did not tell her that. What's the judge going to say? Y'all get out of here. Stop wasting my time. Unless you have something in writing. Think good advice in real estate and in life. Y'all write this down. Document everything. If you didn't document it, you didn't do it. Other questions? Is that anything we talked about so far? Validity of contracts? Okay. So we've been going on and on about these essential elements of a valid contract. So what are those essential elements? What are the things that the judge is looking for when they're trying to determine if a contract is valid? And we're going to break all these down and talk about these. These are just the introduction, if you will. So we're going to spend some time talking about each of these. When we talk about essential elements, I want you guys to think of required cake ingredients. If you want to make a cake this evening after class, aren't there certain ingredients that you have to have? You have to have flour, egg, oil, water, whatever else you need to make a cake, whatever else Betty Crocker tells you to make. But if you try to make a cake without flour, you don't have cake, right? If you try to say, I have a contract without consideration, you don't have a contract. These are the required ingredients. And the first essential element, the first required ingredient of a valid contract is mutual assent. Mutual assent is our meeting of the minds. The two parties have to agree to enter into a contract together. An offer is made, it's considered, and it's eventually accepted. The parties have to voluntarily agree. The two parties agreeing are the offeror and the offeree. The offeror is the giver of the offer. The person that created the offer and said, I'm presenting my offer to you. The giver of the offer. The offeree is the receivee of the offer. If I present an offer to you, I'm the offeror. You are the offeree. The majority of time in real estate transactions, the buyer makes the first offer to the seller. But I don't want you guys to get stuck in your head that the buyer's the offeror and the seller's the offeree. The offeror is the person given the offer. The offeree is the receivee, the person receiving the offer. There are cases, and it's perfectly acceptable for the seller to make an offer to the buyer, the first offer to the buyer. That's why I don't want you guys get it stuck. The offeror is the buyer. No, the offeror is the giver. The offeree is the receivee. So when an offer is first made, first considered, and because the majority of time in real estate, the buyer is the one making the offer to the seller, we have the buyer as the offeror, and we're going to have the seller as the offeree. So in this scenario, the buyer's making the offer to the seller. They're extending an offer across the line to the seller. The offeree always has three choices. When they receive an offer, the offeree always has three choices. They can accept it, they can reject it, and they can counter it, or they can counter it. If they accept it, they're agreeing to all the terms exactly as they are. Exactly. No, any change. I don't care how small it is. Any change is not acceptance. If you're accepting somebody's offer, you're agreeing to everything exactly how it is. The offeree may reject it. Flat out say no, thanks, but no thanks. A rejected offer is dead on the table. There is no going back. You cannot revive a rejected offer. The offeree may also choose to counter offer. Counter offers are a rejection with a but. I'm good with all the terms, but the purchase price. We've agreed to everything else. I'm going to counter offer. I'm going to take your offer I'm going to reject it. I'm going to present you a new offer with a different purchase price. In the event of a counteroffer, the roles reverse. The offeror becomes the offeree. The offeree becomes the offeror. So in this scenario, buyer makes an offer to the seller. Here's an offer to buy your house. Seller says, I'm good with all the terms, but this, this, and this. The seller is now making the offer to the buyer. The seller's now the offeror, the buyer's the offeree. And now the buyer is the offeree. They have three choices, don't they? They can accept it, reject it, or counter it. Every time you counter, those roles reverse. The offeree is now making an offer, becomes the offeror, and is now making an offer. So there's this magic moment in time that we alluded to earlier. There's this magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract. And that magic moment in time is when the last offeree accepts it, when the last offeree accepts it in writing. If you got verbal acceptance, you got nothing. So the last offeree accepts it in writing, and then they have to communicate acceptance to the offeror. So the offeree accepts, and then they cross the line and tell the offeror, I have accepted, I have signed your offer. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. We'll see this again several times, actually. We're going to bring in scenarios in just a bit where you have real estate agents involved and how that communication of acceptance looks when the buyer or seller have a real estate agent in the transaction. In this scenario, if you guys were the listing agent and the buyer's agent calls you and says, my guys have accepted. As the listing agent in this scenario, your knee-jerk reaction needs to be to ask, has it been signed? When they call you and tell you that your offer's been accepted, but has it been signed? Because if you got verbal, you've got absolutely nothing. And for those of you practicing in this market, for those of you active practicing right now, it's crazy out there right now. You get, my firm had a listing a couple weekends ago. We were on the market Saturday and Sunday, like half a day on Sunday. I mean, showings were booked up. They ended up with 45 offers, 45 offers. Only one can be accepted, right? 44 people had to be told no. Only one can be accepted. So it's so important that when you're in a situation like that, that you know, has it been signed? Questions on this so far? Again, we'll spend more time talking about the line, is what I call it, drawing the line. We'll talk more about communicating across the line. And again, we'll bring in scenarios with the real estate agent. But bottom line, for the mutual assent, meeting of the minds, an offer has to be made, considered, and eventually accepted. And then communication of acceptance has to cross the line. And we need to verify that it's been signed. I did an open house a couple years ago, and this couple came in and they, looked through the house and everything, and they got done. And I said, do you guys have any questions? And they said, nah. They said, we're just kind of out looking. They said, well, we'll be honest, we're feeling a little defeated right now. They said, we found a house and we negotiated and we had verbal acceptance from the seller. The seller verbally accepted their offer. If you have verbal acceptance, it means what? Unfortunately, it means nothing. They said, we have verbal acceptance, but before the seller could sign, another better offer swooped in and the sellers accepted that one. And I said, wow. I said, I'm really sorry that you guys are I'm sorry. I mean, that's got to be hard, right? You're excited, you have verbal acceptance. But one thing we can do to help protect our people is, well, one, make sure it's signed, but two, explain this to the buyer. Yes, we have verbal acceptance from our seller, but until we get I will be on the phone. I'll call every 5 minutes. Have you guys signed it yet? Have they signed it yet? Have they signed it yet? Have they signed it yet? But until we have that signature, we got nothing. I felt for that couple because a lot of people are probably going through that, especially right now. But it's basic contract law. It is what it is. Okay. How's everybody doing so far? Made it through your first hour, 29 more to go. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and take our first break. Please note the time. It is what, 10 o'clock? We'll just say 10:01. So let's take our break until 10:11. I just put it in the chat in case you don't remember. We'll come back at 10:11. I'll take attendance, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about mutual assent. And again, you're welcome to turn your camera off for break. Just remember, turn it back on when you get back at 10:11. All right. How we doing so far? Everybody good? Do you have any questions so far about anything we talked about? Good. Is this a good review? Most of this isn't much new stuff. So hopefully this will kind of help. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Hey, Julie.
Yeah.
While we're still on that subject, I just want to clarify one thing because this actually came up in a scenario topic question we were discussing at the office the other day. Talking about the contract not being delivered. So even if the contract had gotten signed before delivery, either verbal or physical, it is still not a binding contract. Is that correct?
So you have to have it accepted in writing. And then you have to have communication of that acceptance. So I can call you and say, Robert, my guys have signed. And at that moment in time, we're under contract. It doesn't matter that it's not in your hand yet. That's my next step, right? That's the next big thing. But what you need is it needs to be in writing. And then that communication, the fact that it has been signed has to be communicated. So even though I say, hey, Robert, we got it, even though you don't have it in your hand yet, we're still under contract. And we're getting ready to talk about the different forms of communication. But you're right. Was that the consensus of the office then?
It is, because in the scenario we were discussing was, okay, so if the seller signed, but before communication of acceptance or signage was delivered, showings were set, another better offer was made, and the sellers decided to accept the better offer because even though signed, it was never delivered or communicated that the papers had been signed.
Then you don't have a contract.
Thank you.
Right? You still have an offer that's been signed, but it's not been communicated. So we're going to talk about the importance of communication. I don't know about you guys, but I don't know how I could ever sleep at night if I had to look at, for example, a buyer and say, you didn't get your dream house because I got busy and I didn't have time to communicate and I was going to do it later, da, 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 da. And then in the meantime, another offer comes in, right? Are you with me? So I'd have a hard time dealing with myself if I was the reason. So we'll talk about communication and the importance of communication. And I can't be on 24/7. I think that's a common misconception brand new agents have, is we can be on 24/7. But there's an old saying in this industry that says, if you want to sell a house, just go on vacation. Because I promise you, that's when everybody wants to list. That's when everybody wants to bring. By the time you're pulling your suitcase out of the office, or out of your closet, your phone's going to be blowing up and you're going to just want to go to the beach. But this is why we have peers and coworkers that can help us if we're not available. Because again, me being at the beach is not going to sit well with my buyers for losing that house. Right? Does that make sense? So
Julie,
this is why we make friends. Yeah, John.
To what Robert was saying, if the buyer's agent were to send an email saying the contract has been signed, would that be binding?
All they have to do is communicate. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So if they call, if they email, if they mail, yep. And if Robert's sending an email, hopefully he's attaching that as a PDF, right? So it's been communicated and delivered. But I think that's what I'm kind of hearing. We're making sure we understand the difference of communicate acceptance versus delivering.
So the seller in his case was in the wrong for saying it was accepted and then taking another offer?
Robert saying no. So Robert, you can, yeah.
I'm saying no, John, because in our scenario that we were discussing, the sellers, even if they had signed the contract, let's just say they signed contract at 10:05, at 10:06, before it was communicated to the buyer.
Okay.
Another offer came in, then it was never delivered. It was never communicated.
Okay. There was never a phone call or anything. I got you.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Signing it is just one piece of it, and they never made it to the second piece.
Right.
So unfortunately, and this is a hard pill for buyers to swallow, but unfortunately the seller did nothing wrong. The seller wants what's best for them, right? They want the highest offer, the best price, yakety yak. So, buyer's going to be upset. Of course they are, but basic contract law says we have to have acceptance, and that communication of acceptance has to cross the line. We can deliver it later, but we have to tell the other party, I have accepted in writing your offer. Thank you. Other questions on that? Again, we're going to talk more about communication. We'll see the line again that we just drew, whatever. And then we'll, you guys know what I mean. And then I'll tell you specifically, have a conversation about what you guys can expect to see next Sunday afternoon. But again, this class is just more than getting you through the test next Sunday. So thank you, Robert, for sharing that, because for those that may not be practicing yet, this stuff is real world. This stuff is real life. And I love that you guys had a discussion in your office, because this is it.
You really have.
Nothing upsets me more. Well, let me rephrase that. There's not much more that upsets me when somebody looks at me, nothing you learn in pre-licensing is used in real estate. Well, that's not true. You know, I'm not saying you use every single thing you learn in pre-licensing. I'll tell you, I've never had a buyer look at me and say, Julie, what kind of deed should I take? But basic contract formation, agency, don't tell me you guys don't use that every day. I will call your bluff all day long. Okay. So mutual assent is our first essential ingredient that the judge is going to look for. Again, it's the meeting of the minds. The two parties agreed to enter into the contract together. You may also see mutual assent, meeting of the minds, as referred to as offer and acceptance, because that's what happened. An offer was made, in parentheses, it was considered, and then it was eventually accepted. The offer is a promise by the offeror to the offeree. It's a promise. I promise, if I give you X amount, I'll give you X amount. In exchange, you're going to give me your house. It's a promise. What's the exchange for your house? I'm giving you X amount. And we'll see consideration again in just a second. Consideration is typically money. But what we need to understand for basic contract law, consideration is just anything of value. What do you consider valuable? Most of us are going to say money, right? But we need to take a step back and look at the big picture. Something of value. Love and affection could be consideration. Anything you find valuable. Again, we'll talk more about consideration in just a second. The offer is definite and certain in its terms. There's no uncertainty. There's no, ooh, how much do they want to give me in exchange for my house? It's definite. It's certain. I give you X amount. In exchange, you give me your property. We have a term called contingency or contingent offers. A contingent offer, anytime you have a contingency, what we're saying is, I can't do B if I can't complete A. If I never get to do B, if I never complete A, then I never get to do B. One act has to be completed in order for us to perform. Some common contingencies in the past that you might have heard of. The buyer may have a contingency that says, if I don't get loan approval, I can't buy your house. That contingency doesn't exist anymore, but can the parties agree to add that contingency? Could the buyer present that as an offer to the seller accept it, and they add that as a contingency? Absolutely. Let's get our heads around this. The parties can agree to do whatever they want to. So is it possible? As long as it's legal, the parties can agree to do whatever they want to. An example of another contingency in the past that we used to have. If I don't first sell my house, then I can't buy yours. That's contingent, right? Me buying your home is contingent on me selling mine. Again, we don't see that in our contract, but could the parties agree to add that contingency? It ain't happening in this market, but could they in another market later agree to add that? Absolutely. We actually only have one contingency in our offer to purchase and contract. We may start on that Sunday, but next weekend, next Saturday is going to be our big forms day. And we're going to look at the contract and our addenda and our amendments. The risk of loss provision in our offer to purchase and contract says that the buyer's obligation to complete the purchase is contingent on the property being in the same or better condition as what it was when we went under contract. So the buyer has an expectation. If the house burns down while we're under contract, it's not in the same or better condition, they may not be expected to carry through with those terms. If the house burns down, the buyer has choices, actually. So there's a little preview for something to look forward to next Saturday. We'll talk about that risk of loss provision, and we'll see our one contingency. Listing agreements, MLS advertising, your Facebook post. Guys, those are not offers. They're advertising. The listing agreement is not an offer. The seller is not offering this to the buyer's making the offer to the seller. The seller is simply advertising. The seller is simply welcoming buyers to bring offers. The seller is not obligated to accept an offer, ever. The seller never, even if you get cash offer, listing price, close in 2 weeks, the dream offer, the seller is under no obligation to accept that. So our listing agreements, MLS advertising, Facebook, social media, whatever your platform is, those are simply ads. They're not offers. Part of that mutual assent, the offer and mutual assent, the offer has been made. 3 choices the offeree has. And if they choose to accept, then they are bound to the terms. If they accept, they're agreeing to all the terms exactly as they are. There's no change. Please hear me when I say this. Any change is not acceptance. I don't care how small and insignificant it may seem. You may present an offer that says we want to close on March 31st. And the seller says, eek, I leave that day to go out of town. Can't we just close on the 30th? It's only a day. Is a day a big deal? Well, in the big picture of life, a day isn't a big deal, right? But that day is a change. Is that an acceptance? I'm good with all this except closing on March 31st. No, that's not an acceptance. Any change. Again, I don't care how small and insignificant it may seem. So if we have acceptance, we agree to all the terms exactly as they are. Counter offers, please understand, a counter offer is a rejection. When you counter something, the original offer is dead on the table. So with the counter offer, I'm rejecting your offer. I'm now going to present a brand new offer to you with these terms. I'm good with everything you presented me except the purchase price and the closing date. If we never can come to agreement on the purchase price and the closing date, then we don't have acceptance. It's twofold. I think one of the bigger problem topics with a counter offer is that there is no going back. Remember, a counter offer is a rejection. So once you counter, you've rejected the original offer. You can't later go back and accept the original. Now, let me ask you this. Let's do a scenario. I make you an offer. You counter it. And I say, well, let me think about it. It's up to me now, right? You countered it. Now the ball's in my court. I'm now the offeree and I have 3 choices, accept it, reject it, or counter it. I think, let me think about it. Let me sleep on it tonight. That's a common thing we like to say. Let me sleep on it tonight. You wake up in the morning and go, you know what? I'm good with the original offer. I'm going to go back and accept your original offer. Can you do that? No, because you countered it. You killed it yesterday, right? Could you present to me the exact same offer? Could you do up a new offer and present that to me? And I see heads bobbing yes, and you're absolutely right. Absolutely. There is no going back but you can present a new offer with those same terms. You present an offer to me, I still have 3 choices, right? Even though it was my original offer, it's a new offer now. So now I have 3 choices. I can accept it, reject it, and or counter it. Questions on, again, we're going to see counter offer. Chapter 11 is the one we're skipping. We're going to go out of order in the syllabus, as I mentioned. So we'll do chapter 11 next weekend, and we'll have this come up again. So we've talked about communication of offer and acceptance. How do we communicate acceptance? And thank you, Robert, for bringing that up, because you bring up a very good point. There's a difference in communicating and delivering. So please note, to have contract formation, we have to have communication. Obviously, the next step is to deliver, but you could be under contract without having that contract in your hand. Is everybody good with that? Once you've received communication, how do we communicate offer and acceptance? Well, the big picture says, however the parties agree. Are we going to communicate orally? Are we going to pick up the phone and call you? Are we going to personal delivery? Am I going to drive it to your office? Snail mail, which we'll talk more about in just a second. Or in this day and age, we have fancy electronic communications. Am I going to email it to you? I don't know why that still says fax. Maybe you should cross that out and write text. Am I going to text it to you? I guess fax machines are still out there. Do I have anybody in the medical profession on this call? No, I've heard the fax is coming back in the medical profession, just more secure. Fax tends to be a lot more secure than our emails. So communication of offer and acceptance, again, it's whatever the parties agree to. If I don't want to be communicated via email, then I'm not going to give you my email address. You guys with me? I'm going to tell you how I want you to communicate with me. I gave you guys my phone number. I gave you guys my email. Those are acceptable forms of communication. And when it comes to snail mail, probably one of the oldest rules that we still have in this country, goes back to the day of the Pony Express. The mailbox rule applies only when you're communicating acceptance of an offer. That's worth me saying again. The mailbox rule applies only when you're communicating acceptance of an offer. Mailbox rule doesn't apply when you're negotiating the offer. The mailbox rule doesn't apply when you're terminating the contract. The mailbox rule only applies when you're communicating acceptance of the offer. And what the mailbox rule says is that communication of acceptance has happened when the properly addressed envelope is placed in the federally related mailbox. This is not the mailbox on your front porch or in your front yard, is it? This isn't your personal mailbox. You're either taking it to the big blue mailbox on the corner or you're taking it to the post office. And also please note, properly addressed. Once you place that signed offer in the mailbox, communication of acceptance has happened. It doesn't matter that the recipient won't receive it for 3 to where are we at now? 9 days, whatever. It doesn't matter that it's going to be a while before they receive it. The mailbox rule says communication of acceptance happens when it's placed in the mailbox. And again, the important thing that we understand is that the mailbox rule only applies when we're communicating acceptance of an offer. I had a teammate the other day, had a situation. He got one of his listings under contract. Congratulations, we're under contract. Communication has been signed and communicated. The other agent put the due diligence check in the mailbox. So we go under contract, buyer writes a check to seller, agent places check in mailbox. A week later, we still don't have that mailbox, that check. He said, due diligence is due by the effective date. And the agent's argument was, but the mailbox rule says it's considered effective when I place it in the mailbox. And that's where they got me involved, because they know I teach this stuff. So that's where they got me involved. What does the mailbox rule say? It only applies as a method of communicating acceptance. Does this say as a method of delivering the due diligence fee? Does it say as a method of delivering earnest money? Method of terminating the contract? This only applies as a method of communicating acceptance. Those buyers ended up doing another check that they delivered to the office. And by the way, check number 1 has still not showed up. Where is it? I don't know. Comments on that? And guys, I know what you're thinking. Who uses the mail anymore? Y'all, not everybody has an email. So you may think people are all over electronic, but not everybody has an email. So could you deal with the mailbox rule at some point in your career? I'm talking about it for a reason. Questions on that? When you're communicating acceptance of an offer, communication to the agent is the same as communicating to the principal. So back to our little scenario. Now, instead of the buyer standing by themselves, now the buyer's standing over here as the offeror with an agent. And the seller is standing over here as an offeree with their agent. So now that we've added agents to the mix, now that you and I are involved, let's walk through our scenario again. Buyer is the offeror, the giver of the offer, makes an offer to the seller. The seller is the offeree. Seller has 3 choices. Y'all want to walk through it with me? The seller can accept it, reject it, or counter it. Let's just say, for simplicity, in this example, the seller accepts it, which means they have signed it. The seller has signed it. They have accepted the offer. The seller calls their agent and says, hey, we've accepted the offer. When the seller calls their agent, did that communication cross the line? When the seller calls their agent, does the offeror know that their offer's been accepted? No, because the agent's standing on the same side of the line with the seller, aren't they? The seller's standing on the right-hand side. So when they call you, the listing agent, and say, I've accepted, of course, you're going to say, but have you signed it? Yeah, I signed it. The very next thing that the listing agent in this scenario is going to want to do is call the buyer's agent. Now has communication crossed the line? When the listing agent calls the buyer's agent, I have acceptance, and then we have communication of acceptance. The buyer's agent's going to say what? The buyer's agent's going to say, yeah, but has it been signed? Once we have confirmation it's been signed, guys, congratulations, you're under contract. As the buyer's agent, what's the very next phone call you should make? As the buyer's agent,
To the buyer.
yeah, call your buyer, tell them the good news. It's not you're almost under contract. It is you are under contract. Everybody with me? Because communicating to us is the same as communicating to our principal. So once the agents are involved, the agents are the one communicating. Truth be told, I don't want my buyers and sellers talking. Absolutely not. That's why they have me. I don't want them in the same room until possibly the lobby of the attorney's office at closing. Possibly. In the meantime, I'm going to talk directly to the other agent. And once that other agent calls me and says, my guys have accepted, of course, I'm going to say, but has it been signed? Knee-jerk reaction. Verify it has been signed. And at that point in time, you're under contract. Congratulations.
So,
Yeah.
Let's be specific. When you say verify that's been signed, do you mean you ask your agent to share with you a copy of the signed agreement?
And
Contract?
that would be if you call me and say, we've accepted, I'm gonna say, it's been signed, right? Yes, Julie, it's been signed. Okay, when can I expect that? When are you gonna email
I
that to
see.
me? And you're gonna say, well, I'm out, as soon as I get home, I'm gonna email it to you, right? But you communicated that acceptance. You put us under contract when you called me.
And I, the buyer, or the seller, am under contract the moment the buyer's agent has contacted you, my agent.
Once once the listing agent calls the buyer's agent, yep, once that communication
done.
crosses the line, we're done. Both
Thanks,
parties are now legally bound to each other.
Thank you, Julie.
Yep. And again, the next step is delivering. I need we need copies of that, right? Because we got to move forward. So again, understand the difference in communicating and delivery. You can shoot a text. My guys have signed. You can communicate in whatever form of communication the parties agree to. Electronic, oral, personal delivery, mailbox, carrier pigeon, it doesn't matter. Whatever form of communication the parties agree to. Good questions, thank you. For your exam next Sunday, you guys are gonna get scratch paper. I'll let you have scratch paper. And I want you to use your scratch paper. And for your exam on Sunday, I highly recommend you guys draw the line. Follow this communication, because the test question for this is like this long, right? It's a big one. And you're going to have a couple counters. And in the end, you need to know who the last offeree is and who the last offeror is. You have to know who had the last person to sign it, and you have to know the last person that has to communicate acceptance. So I suggest you draw the line, walk it through, so you can actually see, is what we did right here, see that communication cross the line. This is one way. Let's call this a problem topic. One thing that we like to do on a test, when the seller calls their agent, I think we tend to think, ooh, an agent knows, so we're under contract. But I need you guys to see agent calling agent or seller calling buyer, right? If agents weren't involved, I need you guys to see that communication crossing the line. The other thing to understand for test in the real world, of course, I only need one form of communication to cross the line. The first form of communication that crosses the line is the one that counts. So let's say my guys have signed and I call you and I leave you a voicemail. My guys have signed. As soon as I get back to the office, I'm going to send it to you. I leave you a voicemail. And then I follow up with a text message. And then when I get back to the office, I email you the offer. I just gave you 3 forms of communication, didn't I? I first called you and left you a voicemail. I then texted and then emailed. What's the one that put us under contract?
Voicemail, as long as they don't.
The voicemail, the first one. The text is a follow-up. I can be a little obnoxious. I know that. I'm going to keep at you until I know you've received my communication. Did you get my voicemail? Did you get my voicemail? Did you get my voicemail? The text is a follow-up to a voicemail. The email is me delivering. Does that make sense to everybody? The one that crossed the line, the one that put us under the contract, was the first form of communication. Questions or comments? Concerns?
Yeah, Julie, I guess this goes back again that we're going all around the question I was asking. Say a buyer's agent communicates with the seller's agent and says, yes, we accept the contract, we'll get it delivered to you tomorrow morning. They never email this, they never send you a text, nothing, no digital copy whatsoever. The next morning they act like they don't know what you're talking about. I'm sure that's happened.
Oh yeah.
The contract got too close to an unexpected bill and spontaneously combust, whatever. Under statute of frauds, that's not in writing any longer. Nobody has any proof of that.
That's not true, because these people, the other side has the proof of it, right? So the fact that now this is where we go back to document everything. Because you're right. If you tell me we're under contract and I never get it and I'm calling you, I'm going, John, where's my contract? John, where's my contract? Right. I'm not saying, John, where's my offer? Because you called me yesterday and told me that your guys have accepted. That was communication of acceptance. So again, this takes us back to document everything. If you call me, I'm going to say, great. When can I expect it? Tomorrow morning? Fantastic. And I'm going to keep at you. And eventually, if you still won't respond to me, I'm getting our BICs involved, because I knew yesterday that we were under contract. I'm sorry that you don't feel like sending it to me this morning like you said you would. You with me? This is the importance of communicating. This is the importance of acting promptly when it comes to, things like this, because communication and delivery are two different things. You called me yesterday and said you guys have accepted. I verify that it's signed. It's out there. It is in the universe out there. It does not matter that I don't have it in my hand yet. And honestly, in that scenario, and you and I were running back and forth, I'd let my BIC call your BIC. That's why my BIC gets paid the big bucks, right?
Yeah, so just step away from it and let them handle it.
I'd call my BIC and I'd be like, dude told me he was going to send it and I need this, and where is it? My BIC would say, okie doke, and get on it.
Okay.
Julie, can I piggyback on John real quick?
Please.
Specifically about the voicemail deal. So you say you contact the buyer's agent voicemail and it gets deleted somehow or another, and that's the only form of communication you sent. And you really don't have a copy of the voicemail because it went to their voicemail. Obviously you want to follow up with a text and email as quick as you can, but if voicemail is the only form and you don't have a copy of it because you don't have their voicemail, but it gets deleted. It's he said, she said.
And the judge is going to say, come on, guys, and that's where, again, if the BICs can't figure this out, right, then that's where the judges are going to have to get involved. And that's another reason why, like I just told, I'm serious. You ever do a deal with me, just go ahead and tell me you've received it, because I'm going to keep at you until I hear from you. And remember, with voicemail, it's verbal communicate, right? The voicemail gets deleted. We do have a log where I called you, so at least we still have that. But that log doesn't prove that I communicated acceptance. It just proves that I called you on this date at that time. So delivery, absolutely key. I'm certainly not trying to downplay that, get to your hands, but this is what takes me back to document everything. And are there people out there that are shady and don't play by the rules? Unfortunately, yes. So this is why we have the knowledge. This is why we have the power. And this is, again, if you ever do deal with me, you're gonna be like, oh my God, Julie, here's the damn contract. Leave me alone. Thank you. Have a nice day, right? I'm gonna keep at you till I get it, because I'm protecting my clients. I'm protecting my people. You telling me you're gonna do it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, that doesn't help my people. Other questions or comments?
I was just going to say that in some of the transactions that I've worked with, agents really usually do appreciate, the communication.
Communication. Thank you.
They don't really, you kind of apologize. Hey, I'm sorry. I know I'm driving you crazy. And every agent I've worked with has said, no, thank you for communicating. Thank you for the email, text. Voicemail.
Exactly. Because guys, remember, it's not about me.
Right.
It's not about me. It's about protecting my client. It's about knowing. And your buyer, if you're thinking about it, if you're that agent that's being that little gnat and being a little annoying, it's because their client's going, where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? They're on them to get the, so we're doing what's best for our client. And I agree with you, Penelope. I think most people are appreciative of communication. And I think most agents are on point, when it comes to it. But you got your exceptions. Every industry has its bad egg, right? And real estate is no exception. So again, I can't stress the importance of communication, especially when you're creating that contract, when you're forming that contract. What's the best to get it communicated and then get it delivered. Okay, so let's look at a scenario. Let's look at an example together. A buyer who is represented by an agent has presented an offer to the seller on Monday. On Tuesday, the seller decides to accept the offer. The seller signs, and on Tuesday night, the seller's agent tells the buyer's agent the seller's accepted the offer. Am I under contract? Think about the two things that I need. Am I under contract? I need it to be signed, and I need communication of acceptance to cross the line. What do you guys think? Am I under contract? See some heads bobbing. Yeah, I'm under contract. Yeah. Seller signs. Seller's agent tells buyer's agent. Communication cross the line. Congratulations, folks. We're under contract. Everybody with me? The seller signed. They considered, they accepted, and they signed. Seller's agent calls buyer's agent. Communication crosses the line. Yay, we're under contract. But it's late that night, so the buyer's agent decides to wait until Wednesday morning to tell the buyer. Buyer sleeps on it evidently and wakes up Wednesday morning, and decides they want to change their mind and revoke their offer. Guess what, folks? It's too late because that communication has already crossed the line. So it's not just important that you and I communicate as agents, but it's also important that we communicate with our clients. Let them know the good news. If your buyer looks at you and says you are absolutely under no circumstance to call me after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, whatever, never ever call me. I mean, obviously we're going to follow their rules, right? But that buyer needs to understand that, especially when we're in the throes of negotiation, if I receive acceptance at 10:05 and you tell me not to call you after 10, that buyer needs to understand that things can happen after that 10 o'clock. And my question to that buyer is, what's the absolute earliest I can call you on Wednesday morning? Because when I receive acceptance at 10:05, we're under contract.
I would take the butt chewing and make the phone call.
Would you, or at least send an email, right? So you have documentation. Yeah. And you'll have buyers out there say, don't call me after 9, or that's family, and that's fine. They're the boss, right? They're the one hired me. They're the boss. But you need to understand that things can still happen after we stop communicating. Does that make sense to everybody? And especially if we're in the throes of negotiations. I can't imagine a buyer saying, okay, there's an exception this one time. Okay, everybody good? We good with that? Okay, all right. So let's talk about how offers terminate. Please note, this says offer. We're going to talk about how contracts terminate in just a bit. But right now we're just focusing on how offers terminate. A counteroffer is a rejection. So a counteroffer is a rejection of the original offer. Of course, a rejection is a rejection. Lapse of time. The offeror can put an expiration date on their offer. The offeror can say, here's my offer. This is good until tomorrow, February 20th at 5 p.m. If we don't have acceptance by tomorrow afternoon by 5 p.m., the offer's dead because the offeror chose to put an expiration date on it. Now I'll show you the form in just a bit. When we look at our forms, there's an actual additional provisions addendum we can use to put an expiration date on it. Offers can be revoked. This is important. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. I make the offer, I don't have acceptance yet, I can still take my offer back. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. I believe that's worth me saying again. Again, I can be obnoxious sometimes. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. Your buyer makes an offer, They wake up tomorrow and go, no, 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 never mind. Reach out to the listing agent. We're revoking our offer. Best of luck to you and your sellers. Have a nice day. We're done. Death or insanity of the offer, or the person given the offer would also terminate the offer. Interestingly enough, when we look at our offer to purchase and contract next week, we're going to learn that death is only an out when you're negotiating an offer. Once you're under contract, death is not an out. So we'll see that next week. Death is only an out when you're negotiating the offer. Questions? All right, let's take a pause here just for 1 second. And I want to take you guys to the North Carolina Real Estate Commission's website. I don't know if you guys have explored or played around here yet. There's some really good information on the commission's website. So you guys feel free to play around. I'm sure as you start taking posts or learn more about posts, you'll start learning about where the information is. I will say this, while you're still learning the website, if you don't know where to access stuff, their search bar is pretty intuitive. So it's a good, sometimes you search for something and you get words that you didn't even search for and you're like, how did they? No, theirs is pretty good. So if you're looking for something specific, I like their search bar. One of my favorite tabs in the Real Estate Commission is their publications tab. And by the way, ncrec.gov, or just Google North Carolina Real Estate Commission. And it's a public site, so anybody can access this. So if you look at publications, they have a whole plethora of stuff here. Here's that real estate manual if you want the digital. This is where you can get the digital real estate manual. One of the things I like a lot, the Real Estate Commission has provided us with some Q&A brochure. Now let me rephrase that. The Real Estate Commission has provided the public with Q&A brochures. Remember, they're protecting the public. And in one way they can protect the public is to help educate the public. And so they provide these brochures that a lot of us use, because why recreate the wheel, right? The Real Estate Commission's already created them, so it's here for us to use to help educate our clients as well. And we're going to look at a few of these over the course of this class. But one in particular, while we're here and talking about it, is the brochure, the Q&A on offer and acceptance. So we can use this to, one, better help ourselves understand this process and how this happens, and that magic moment in time when it goes from being an offer to a contract. But we can also use this to help with our buyers and sellers, help our buyers and sellers understand that magic moment in time. So again, my couple at the open house, they were so defeated. I mean, you could just see they were just, and this might have been, I don't know their agent, I don't know what they did or did not do, but this might have been a good time for the agent to explain, you may not agree with what the seller did, but the seller didn't do anything wrong because this is the offer and acceptance process. So they provide us these tools to help us communicate, help us work with our buyers and sellers. And I point this out to you guys, you're going to be tested on this next week, but some of you are working with buyers and sellers, some of you getting ready to. So make yourself a note. You may want to go to the real estate commissions and pull this. When you're working, you can also order the, it's like a nice glossy brochure. You got to pay for that. I'm frugal. I like the free PDF. That's my preference. So you can get either one, even the nice, pretty, or the flat PDF. But I think that would be good for you guys to take a look at, and the Q&A. And I believe because the buyer's the one making the offer most of the time, this brochure is written towards the buyer, but it's going to be basic offer and acceptance. So I found a home. How do I make an offer? Does my offer have to be in writing? The Real Estate Commission says, well, in order for it to be enforceable, it does. What should be in my offer? Earnest money, communication. So again, you guys make a note. Real Estate Commission's website, publications, and under publications is all sorts of good stuff, but including the Q&A brochure. Yep. Publications. It's weird. It's publications and then publications. So it's kind of, you got to do it twice. But you got to do it twice. And then you find those Q&A brochures. We're going to look at a few other of these. There's some good stuff. It's some good information. Questions or comments? Okay. It's break time again, isn't it? I know that because I'm out of coffee. I don't need a clock to tell me that it's break time. I know that because I need coffee. So let's go ahead and take 10. Let's see, it's 10:56. We'll say 10:57. So we'll come back at 11:07. Again, please keep track of your time. 11:07, and we keep going in chapter 10. Okay. We back? Everybody doing good? Everybody good for, I think about an hour and 20 minutes, and then we'll take our nice long lunch break. Is that fair enough? Everybody good? And of course, if you need to step away for a second, you're welcome to. So don't feel like you're stuck here for under 3 hours. You can, it's over 3 hours that we have the problem. All right. So our essential elements of a contract. First, probably the one we spend the most time talking about is our mutual assent. Everybody good with that? Meeting of the minds. The two parties have to agree to enter into the contract together. Questions on our offer and acceptance, mutual assent, meeting of the minds? Okay. The second essential element, the second essential required ingredient that we have, if you will, is consideration. Consideration tends to be the problem topic, the one that we struggles with the most. There are no free promises, you guys. Anytime an offer is made, it has to be backed. It has to be supported with some form of consideration. Now, typically, again, in our offer to purchase and contract, that consideration is the purchase price. But understand, consideration is just something of value. Is that consideration money? Is it the purchase price? Is that consideration love and affection? Is that consideration 6 goats? What do you find valuable? And that's the consideration. In exchange for this, I'm giving you some form of consideration. So we have to have any legally binding contract, any valid contract, I should say, valid contract has to have some form of consideration, something of value. Our contracts have to have legal capacity. Remember, a valid contract can become voidable. How many parties have the right to take a valid contract to a judge and request it be voidable? How many parties? You can show me on your hands. Yep, just one. If a judge is claiming a contract voidable, it's because one of those parties has gone to the judge and said, hey, I'm a minor. A minor can enter into a contract. Ain't that something? 17-and-a-half-year-old can enter into a contract, but they can't be forced to carry through with the terms because they're a minor. So that 17-and-a-half-year-old takes the contract to the judge. The judge says, you're only 17-and-a-half years old. You shouldn't have to carry through with the terms of this. This contract is voidable. As we said, somebody that's been declared mentally incompetent, in fact, the medical profession has declared them mentally incompetent. The courts have not. That could make the contract voidable. And somebody that's intoxicated or under the influence, legal or illegal substances, if it can be proven that they were intoxicated or under the influence when they entered under the contract, all of those may make the contract voidable. It's a valid contract. Is everybody good with that? The contract itself is perfectly valid. One party has the right to make it voidable. So part of our legal capacity, just because you can contract, doesn't mean you should be expected to carry through with those terms. Somebody that's declared mentally incompetent by the medical profession and the court of law is who could make the contract void. So we got 2 different scenarios. You've been declared mentally incompetent. You may be able to make the contract voidable. You've been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. You may be able to make the contract void. The thinking here is that the courts have decided that this individual doesn't have the mental capacity to enter into a legally binding contract. Everybody good on the difference? Everybody hear the difference I'm saying? It's what the judge has weighed in, what the courts have said. If the courts haven't said anything, voidable. If they have, it's void, could be void. We're going to talk more about voidable again in just a minute. So we'll see this come up again. Contracts have to be for a lawful objective. You cannot have a legally binding contract for an illegal purpose. If my drug dealer shorted me my stash this week, I can't take that to the judge, can I? Just seeing if y'all are paying attention. I can't take that to the judge, can I? Why? Because my stash is not a legal act. I got to come up with other ways. A valid contract has to have a lawful objective. It has to have legal consideration. It has to be for a legal purpose. I think for our real estate, I think where we may come across this, any contract calling for immoral performance. I think the best example of immoral performance we have in real estate is any discriminatory act. You guys hopefully are very familiar with fair housing, the protected classes. If your contract discriminates against any of the protected classes, that's not a legally binding contract. That's not a valid contract. Who can remind me, there's a law that says there are certain documents that have to be in writing and signed so that they are enforceable. Does anybody remember the name of that law? Has to be in writing and signed to be enforceable. You're close. Connor's close. Sherman Antitrust Act tells us about price fixing. It tells us that there are no set commission, right? There we go. There we go. We're looking for the statute of frauds. This is why we're here. Statute of frauds is the act that says all contracts for sale or conveyance of real property have to be in writing and signed. Why do we require them to be in writing and signed? So that they are enforceable. You need something tangible to take to the judge. And that's what the statute of frauds is saying. If you can't take anything tangible to the judge, it's unenforceable. Statute of frauds. We're going to talk a little bit more about statute of frauds in just a second. Expand on that a little bit more. Any questions about our 5 essential elements, the 5 required ingredients? What is the judge going to look for to determine if they have a valid contract in their hand? They're looking for these 5 essential elements, these 5 ingredients. Any questions on that? So let's kind of go back to our meeting of the minds discussion just a bit. Let's kind of expand on that a little bit more. And with meeting of the minds, you have to have necessity of mutual consent. And the necessity of mutual consent says if you don't have this, true meeting of the minds, then you don't have a contract. So necessity of mutual consent. And there are some circumstances that could come up under this the meeting of the minds, the necessity of mutual consent, that may or may not affect the validity of a contract. So one thing we're going to look at, the judge is going to look at for is mistake of fact. It's a mutual mistake. Both parties made the mistake. It's not fraud. The difference in fraud and misrepresentation is intent. We'll talk about both in just a second. Some kind of error leads both parties to believe this is the contract they're entering into. The judge finds a mistake of fact. The judge renders a mistake of fact, and that may make the contract voidable because the parties didn't know what they were contracting to do. You guys with me? Because there was some error. We both believe the error. Nobody lied. Nobody is just, it was mistakes happen. I don't know about you guys, but I'm human and I make mistakes every single day. Mistakes just happen. The judge may make it voidable if it's relevant to the contract. If it would affect that meeting of the minds any differently. Mistake of law does not excuse a party's obligation. Have you guys ever heard that saying that we all mistake of, what is it? Mistake of law is ignorance of law. There it is. Ignorance of law is not an out. The presumption here is that if we don't know the law, we have the tools, we have the access to find out. We can call an attorney. Yes, they cost money. But mistake of law is not going to be an out. It's not going to affect the validity of a contract. There's an absolutely fascinating story in your books. If you happen to have your book in front of you, turn to page 304. And under mistake of law, on page 304, they discuss the case, I think, yeah, Willis versus Willis. And in Willis versus Willis, a widow signs her last will and testament, later signs a warranty deed conveying the property she owned to one of her two sons, reserving a life estate. Unfortunately, the grantee's son died before his mother, at which point the mother wanted to change her mind, basically, and give the property to her other surviving son. Had she devised the property to her son in the will, she could have changed the terms, but she had already conveyed the property to the son that just passed away. This went to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and it was found that it was a unilateral mistake, and they were not going to support the reformation of the deed. So check out that last sentence. The grantee's son's surviving spouse was awarded the property because that's what yeah, doesn't that make for an interesting Thanksgiving? Because that's what his will said. Where did she go wrong? She conveyed the property to him, and after he died, she just, oh no, never mind. And the Supreme Court said, you made a mistake of law, and we're not going to reform that deed. We're not going to change that. Ouch. Mistake of law is not an excuse. We all have access to the law. With necessity of mutual consent, talk about fraud. If the judge is determining a fraud has happened, the judge is looking for these four points. The judge is the one that determines if it's fraud. The judge is making sure they need to confirm that false information was delivered or the information was omitted. They either received a lie or they didn't get anything at all. It was made or not made with knowledge of its falsity, knew it was a lie. It was made with the intent that it be acted upon, and the other party acted upon it. If the judge can find fraud, if the judge can look at these four pieces and determine fraud has happened, the judge may make the contract voidable. I have a feeling it's kind of hard to prove fraud. I mean, like hook me up to a lie detector test kind of thing. Is that where we're heading? I think a good example of this that we may see, if the seller lies on their RPODs residential property and owners association disclosure statement. Remember, a seller doesn't have to disclose anything. They can say no representation. If they choose to answer, they have to do so honestly. They cannot lie. Again, I think it would be tough to prove this, but if the injured party, the party that was lied to, can prove fraud, the judge may make the whole thing voidable. Don't confuse fraud with innocent misrepresentation. Innocent misrepresentation is still false information. The difference is intent. Did I mean to lie to you? Or did I honestly believe this lie myself? Let's say I have a tract of land to sell, and I advertise that I have 7 acres of land. I think it's 7 acres. I genuinely believe it's 7 acres. When I bought it, it was 7 acres. I didn't want to be bothered to have a survey done. So when I bought it, I truly thought it was 7 acres. Now I'm turning around and selling it. You go under contract thinking you're buying 7 acres. You have your survey done. Lo and behold, it's only 5 acres. We are both shocked. You're blown away. What do you mean 5? I thought we had 7. That's innocent misrepresentation. Fraud. I have 7 acres. I know darn well I have 7 acres, but I only have, no, let me rephrase that. I advertise 7 acres. I know darn well I only have 7 acres, but come to find out I have 5, and I knew I had 5. I'm still not saying that right. I have 7, advertise 7. What am I missing? There's a piece of my brain that's just not making that connection. I have 7, you have your survey done, and it's only 5, and I say, oh, I know. I'm not making sense here.
If she was to say that she had it surveyed and knows she had 7.
Thank you. Thank you. Advertise 5. There we go. Thank you, guys. See, we all need each other. I advertised 5, even though I knew. What you need to understand. No, I'm still not doing it right, am I? You guys help me out. The difference is intent. See, I'm not a good liar. That's my problem with this. I'm not a good liar. So I can't even make up a sample where I'm lying to you. The difference in fraud and innocent misrepresentation is intent. Are you lying and that's a mistake, or are you lying because you know you're lying? Am I good with that? Did I botch that up too bad? Intent. Write that word down.
I think what you're trying to say, Julie, is she had it surveyed. She knew it was 5, but she advertised it as 7.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. See, every single day I make mistakes. It happens. Also for necessity, let's see. Yeah, also for necessity and mutual consent. We have something out there called the Unfair Deceptive Trade Practices Act. The Unfair Deceptive Trade Practices Act, if any of these things are found, it could invalidate the contract. So the Trade Practices Act protects the consumer. If they're provided a misleading opinion, failure to disclose a material fact, any misleading advertising, you guys make sure you may remember puffing. Puffing is an exaggerated opinion. Puffing's okay. Be very careful that puffing doesn't cross the very fine line to a lie. I know we like to get very descriptive with our adjectives and everything, but just be careful that your opinion, your over-exaggerated opinion, doesn't cross that fine line to a lie in your advertising. Or misrepresenting the nature or extent of a warranty. These are the acts specifically mentioned by the Unfair Deceptive Trade Practices Act. This act applies to most sellers. It does not apply to the for sale by owner, the one that just sells a property once in their life. Now, if they're an investor and they sell property for a living, they fall under the unfair deceptive trade practices. And we fall under this as well. FSBO, FSBO, for sale by owner. Another thing to consider for the necessity of mutual consent is duress. If an individual enters into a contract under duress, they are being forced to enter into the contract due to violence or threat of violence. Somebody is being forced to enter into the contract against their will. And if they later can prove that they entered under the contract under duress, the judge may make that voidable. You can't, remember, contracts need to be entered into voluntarily. So you cannot threaten somebody or their family. That would be duress. If somebody enters under into the contract under undue influence is more taking advantage of the emotional side of it. Maybe you have a relationship where one party has power over the other and they take advantage of that emotional. I think one of the bigger examples that we hear about on a regular basis is when the family hires somebody to care for their elderly parent, and that caretaker forces the elderly parent under undue influence, maybe sell the house or something. That also would make the contract voidable. Again, of course, contracts have to be completed, performed voluntarily. You know, another good example of this might be if you look at your mom and say, you know, Mom, I'm not coming home for Christmas this year if you don't sell the house. Assuming Mom wants you to come home for Christmas, she could later decide that she was entered under undue influence. Who knows? Mom might say, fine with me. But assuming, you know, she sold the house because of your threat, you took advantage of that emotional. Questions on our necessity of mutual consent. Again, big picture. Two parties have got to agree to enter into the contract together on their own terms, voluntarily. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more, a little deeper about our statute of frauds. As we said, the statute of frauds is the act that says all real estate contracts, any transfer of real property has to be in writing and signed. Why? So that it's enforceable. Guys, that's a full sentence. Don't just say it has to be in writing and signed. Don't stop there. It has to be in writing and signed. Why? To be enforceable. The purpose of the statute of frauds is to try to prevent perjury, forgery, false testimony. What we were talking about earlier, I was going to closing for one of you and signing your documents. Statute of frauds would get on that. So even though unless I had full power of attorney for you, if you got oral, you got nothing. An oral agreement is not enforceable in a court of law. Statute of fraud says any contract to sell or convey land. They specifically mention contracts for leases exceeding 3 years. Statute of frauds does not require all leases to be in writing and signed. Specifically, statute of fraud says leases exceeding 3 years. Now, is it just good advice to get all leases in writing? Of course it is. Julie's telling you, even if it's a lease for a day, get it in writing. Your test probably isn't going to ask you what Julie thinks, though. Your test is going to ask you what the statute of fraud says. So what's the statute of fraud say? Any lease exceeding 3 years, all contracts to sell or convey property. Failure to put these in writing and signed, the judge may make the contract void. To comply with the statute of frauds, the judge is making sure that they have several components. Let's think of these as the essential ingredients, the essential elements to comply with the statute of frauds. The document in writing has to have the names of the parties, the subject matter, the material terms and conditions, what's the contract about, and then the signature of the party to be charged. Again, there's a really fascinating story in your book. The bottom of page 307 talks about seller gave the buyer an option to purchase land for $45,000. The buyer paid for the option by a check in the amount of $500, and the check was endorsed and cashed by the seller. On the front of the check, the buyer wrote for option on the rest of this tract of land. Some weeks later, the seller refused to convey the property, claiming that the option contract did not comply with statute of frauds. This one went to the Court of Appeals. They found that the check met the requirements of the statute of frauds, and the option contract was enforceable. The check had the information. The check had these essential elements. Now, before you get too excited, look at the next paragraph. This example is not to encourage us to use checks or sketchy memoranda. Sketchy memoranda is actually listed in your real estate manual. But this is simply here just to show you about an example about how informal a document can be and still comply with the statute of frauds. In addition to the contract itself, the statute of frauds says the contract, any modifications, any changes to the contracts has to be in writing, signed by both parties. Why? So that it is enforceable. Questions on our statute of frauds? Okay. Fairly new to real estate in the big picture, not old at all, fairly new to our lives, as a matter of fact, is the invention of electronic transactions, e-signatures, e-documents. Guys, I've been in the industry 20 years. When I started 20 years ago, the e-world didn't exist yet. 20 years ago, we were phasing out, we were getting there, but it hadn't started yet. It's not been around that long. We had those 3-ply forms, like a pink, a yellow, and a white, and you had to push down super hard to get it, the carbon copies. You guys remember these, to get it to go through the whole thing? Now they were phasing out. We were just being introduced to zip forms, and a lot of agents are going, why would I use that? I remember in our storage room, we had stacks and piles and so many of those carbon copy forms, because everybody's like, wow, I'm using zip forms. Electronic transactions, technology moves faster than the law. Technology always moves faster than the law. So electronic transactions were a thing. We had to adapt some laws before we could allow this to happen in real estate. You guys signed a contract from Lane to be here today. And she probably had you sign something through .loop. So you got the email from Lane, you clicked on the link, you had to adopt your signature. So it probably looked something like this. You chose how you wanted your name to look. That doesn't look like my actual signature. If you were to ask me to wet sign something, that wouldn't be how it looked. But it was my electronic signature that I adopted. And I'm certain, I have no doubt, that before you guys signed the contract from Lane, you all clicked on terms of use and you read every single word of the conditions. Yes? All of you? No, come on. We do this every day, don't we? You go to the internet, you click on I agree to all your terms, and how very rarely do we read it? Y'all want to know one thing you agree to? One thing, look at you guys getting scared. One thing you guys agreed to when you adopted and signed your signature, you agreed that this e-signature would count as your binding signature. You cannot come back later and get out of the contract with Lane by saying, "Nuh-uh, that's not my actual signature." If you were to click on terms of use, which none of us did, if you were to click on those terms on use, you would see that you agree to allow this e-signature to count as your legally binding signature. And that's part of what the rules, the laws in place about electronic transactions that we have. So we have there's something called the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. And we have a state level, which is the North Carolina Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. And this is the act that pertains to electronic records, electronic signatures, electronic documents. One of the big things the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act says is that by adopting and agreeing to use a signature, you acknowledge that that is your binding signature, even though it doesn't look like if you were to sign your name on a piece of paper, you agree to allow that. The North Carolina Uniform Electronic Transaction Act, again, says signatures are legal so long as the parties agree to use those electronic means. That disclosure of electronic means is required. Every time you send a form out via .loop or DocuSign or SkySlope, I think is the new one. There's several different programs out there. Anytime you send a document out for e-signatures, the party, before they can e-sign it, has to agree. And .loop, whenever you adopt your signature, will have that terms of use that you acknowledge when you adopt and use this signature. Specifically, the UETA defines electronic signatures as an electronic sound, symbol, or process that's attached to a record or adopted by a person with the intent to sign. A process, God, I hate these. The process is where you go to log on to something and it says, here's like 9 pictures, select the pictures with traffic lights or select the pictures with trees. Do you ever see that teeny tiny tree, like that one little part of the, and you wonder if you're supposed to select that? I hate these. That's what a process is. You're identifying that you're a real person. You're identifying that you're not a robot sitting there. Evidently robots can't detect pictures with fire hydrants in them, but you and I can sometimes. Sometimes I think a robot would do better than me. General statute, you don't need to know the general statute. I just put it there so you know it's official. But North Carolina general statute requires a clear and conspicuous statement to be given before the consumer consents to use electronic means. So again, you provided with that terms of use from .loop that you agree to that. We're also going to see when we look at our offer to purchase and contract next week that there's a place that discusses electronic options, electronic signatures in there as well. Do parties have to agree to use e-signatures? Do they have to? Can we force them to? No. Remember what I said earlier, not everybody has an email address. Isn't that step one to doing e-signatures? I got to have somewhere electronically for it to go. So if your buyer or seller says, yeah, I don't have an email, you're going to have to go old school or teach them how to use an email. I had the sweetest couple one time, elderly couple, very sweet. I listed their townhome so they could move to the beach and retire with the grandkids. And I got to the point in the listing presentation about documents, and I asked him if they had an email, and he said, I think I set one of those up a couple years ago. And she said, no, I don't. And I knew at that point I had two choices. I either help them create an email and teach them how to use it, or I drive out there whenever I need a signature. Y'all want to know which one I opted to do? I drove out there every time. That's the job for the grandkids, to teach them how to use email. That's not my job. You guys with me? I can't force them. I'm not listing your house. If you, well, I guess I could say that, but I would have lost the listing, wouldn't I? Not everybody has an email address. Very similar to the UETA and the NCUETA is something called e-sign, Electronic Signatures and Global and National Commerce Act. It's similar to the UETA. The difference is the e-sign regulates commerce across state lines. So if you have buyers or sellers located in a different state, the e-sign is covering that. Again, it all pretty much says the same thing. So I'll share a story with you guys just to show you. I mean, again, 20 years is not that long ago. You think about 20 years ago, we were just for the first time hearing about e-documents, e-records, e-signatures. And I will never forget, I was still an admin back during this time. It's probably 03, 04, somewhere in there. Don't hold me that, but ish. And I will never forget the first agent in my office that did an e-signature. It was a big deal. We were all hanging around the computer, checking it out, watching it happen. This agent had a listing agreement already signed. They were extending the listing agreement. So it was getting ready to expire and they were going to extend it. And he was doing an agency agreement renewal. And we were in High Point and his sellers lived in Yadkinville. What kind of round trip is that to go from High Point to Yadkinville for one signature and then turn around and come back? What are we looking at? 2 hours for something? Yeah. I mean, that's a haul, right? We stood there and watched this happen electronically in like, a minute. I mean, we were all like it was an event, right? Like we were all hanging around the computer watching this. And today we take it for granted, but this hasn't been around that long, if you think about it. And there's going to be new technology to come out every day. Every day, technology is changing and growing. Who knows what technology in real estate is going to look like in 5 years? The rules, the law will have to catch up. Comments on that? Questions? Okay. So we've talked about how offers terminate. Now let's talk about how contracts end. Discharge of contracts. Terminating an offer is different than terminating a contract. The first way that contracts end is by agreement of the parties. If the parties can agree to enter into a contract together, doesn't it stand to reason that the parties can agree to leave a contract together? They can agree to terminate a contract together. And how parties can agree to discharge a contract comes in several different forms. They can release each other. Each party releases the other from their contractual obligations, their contractual duties. They could do a novation. If you do a novation, you're substituting a new contract for an old contract. Maybe you change the terms. Maybe you changed a party. but you're replacing a new contract. Novation, I think, is it Latin? Novation is we'll just say Latin for new. So when you see novation, see new, you're replacing a new contract with an old contract. We could modify the terms. Accord and satisfaction. One or both parties is agreeing to partial performance. Maybe I can't perform exactly as I promised. I can't do this, but instead I can do that. That would be accord and satisfaction. Partial performance. And then the old school way to do it back in the day was to take your red pen and actually write the word cancel across it. We can cancel it just as simple as writing the word cancel across it. Again, you guys, the point here, how we release each other or how we agree to get out of the contract together come in different forms. But the point here is the parties agree to enter into the contract together. The parties can agree to get out of the contract. Other ways we can discharge a contract, well, not much of this doom and gloom. Full performance. Let's get this thing to closing. We get this thing to closing. Both parties have done as they promised. They no longer owe each other anything. They have fully performed. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to work towards every day. It's getting this thing to closing. If either party breaches the contract, one party does or does not do what they promised to do or not to do. We're going to talk about our remedies for breach in just a second. Impossibility to perform may discharge a contract. That would be up to the judge. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe a good example of impossibility to perform. Judge doesn't have to get involved in this. What if we find out when we're under contract, the buyer can't get loan approval? They can't get money, they can't perform, can they? So they may have to terminate because they don't have the money to perform as promised. So a judge may get involved. It may discharge a contract. And then operation of law. If, for example, the seller loses the property to foreclosure or bankruptcy, it's no longer the seller's to sell. And if it's not the seller's to sell, then the contract is no longer in place. Contracts may or may not can be assigned. Whether or not the contract can be assigned has to be spelled out in the terms of the contract. If a contract is assigned, pretty much all the terms stay the same. The only thing that changes is the name of one of the parties. You're taking the liability, you're taking the responsibility for somebody else. Somebody else is standing in your contractual shoes. The terms stay the same. But what changes is the name of one of the parties. I'm giving you my contract. Think about, as an example of this, think about when the lender sells your loan. When the lender sells your loan, does your mortgage payment change? Does your interest rate change? Does the due date change? The only thing that changes is the name of the lender, right? That's an example of an assignment. All the terms stay the same. The court allows for certain rules to help them interpret contracts. So when we talk about rules for interpretation of contracts, we're talking about the court, the judge. And one thing that the judge considers is something called a parole evidence rule. And what the parole evidence rule says is that the final written word will prevail every time. Final written word in the contract will beat any other previous negotiations. Let's say, for example, we're all good with the fact that the refrigerator is personal property, right? Seller can take the fridge. It's personal property. It's not a fixture. Let's say you go to list a house for a seller. And of course, you're going to ask the seller if they're going to leave the fridge or not, because you know every single buyer that you encounter wants to know if the fridge is going to stay. So you have this discussion with your seller. Seller says, yeah, we're going to leave the fridge. Great. You put it in your MLS advertising, fridge to remain with acceptable offer. Buyer shows interest. Buyer specifically says, do I get the fridge? Yeah, you get the fridge. Yeah, seller's going to leave it. Great. The offer's made, it's negotiated, and it's accepted. But we neglected to put the refrigerator as an exception to personal property in the offer to purchase and contract. Does the seller have to leave the refrigerator? And the parole evidence rule says no. Why? Because the fridge didn't make it into the final written word. It doesn't matter, we're all in agreement. It was never an issue. It was a non-issue. It was in my MLS advertisement. None of that matters. What matters is that it makes it into the final written contract. The final written word will prevail. Written's going to win over any previous oral negotiations or any written negotiations every single time. Questions on that? Other things that the judge is going to look for interpreting contracts, they're going to interpret the contract as a whole. In other words, they're not going to piecemeal it. They're not going to say, well, this section's valid and that section's not. It's an all or nothing. Either this contract is valid and enforceable or it's not. Ordinary words are going to be interpreted in their ordinary meanings. You guys are just starting to learn to speak real estate. We have our own language. We have our own jargon. Our industry jargon does not belong in a contract, for example, for a buyer and a seller. Buyers and sellers may not speak real estate. So we need to make sure that we put verbiage in the contract that they understand. It's their contract. We're an industry of acronyms. My gosh, if we can make an acronym out of it, we're going to. Don't put acronyms in contract. Spell it out. Be very, very clear. As we just said, the parole evidence rule says written provisions prevail. We're going to talk just a second about, maybe next week, I don't know. You and I cannot draft. We cannot change verbiage of pre-printed words, pre-printed language. You and I, all we get to do is fill in the blanks. The parties to the contract can draft. The parties to the contract can amend, delete. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Bottom line, just because they can doesn't mean that they should. Because they may not understand the legal ramifications of changing that verbiage. They may not understand that their new written provision, they cross out the pre-printed language and add their own verbiage. That's what they're going to be legally bound to. Anytime your buyer or seller whips out their red pen and says, oh, I'm going to fix this, highly encourage them to talk to an attorney. And then run away, right? No, I'm just kidding. Highly suggest that they talk to an attorney. In any ambiguous language, any word or phrase that could have a vague meaning or multiple meanings, the judge is going to rule in favor of the party that created the ambiguous language. So again, guys, be clear, be precise. Know that not everybody speaks real estate. So when we are completing forms, documents on behalf of other parties, make sure you're speaking their language, non-real estate. It's one thing for us to have a conversation, but make sure you use their language, not ours, with their contract formations. Questions? So we mentioned breach a few minutes ago, and with breach, there's some contract remedies, and we have several different kinds of contract remedies. The first remedies are money damages. In the event of breach, the non-breaching party may be awarded money damages. Compensatory damages are actual damages. With compensatory damages, you should be able to prove that you spent money on this transaction before the breaching party breached. If you're going after compensatory damages, you're being asked to be put back in the same position financially as what you were before you entered into the contract. You're not going above and beyond for pain and suffering. You should be able to show proof, documentation, receipts, invoices, clear checks. You should be able to show proof that you spent money and now you want that money back because the other party breached. Think, for example, in the event of the seller breach, if the seller breaches, the buyer could go after the seller for compensatory damages. They put down due diligence. They put down earnest money. What if they've already had the home inspection performed? What if they've had the appraisal? If they've paid for the appraisal? You guys with me? The buyer can prove to the seller, I spent money on this transaction. You breached. I want to be reimbursed. If the seller's not willing to sit down and write a check, the buyer can sue. Consequential damages. These are additional costs that should have been able to be foreseen by the breaching party. Maybe not caused directly by them. We'll look at our contract next weekend. And one thing we're going to see, for example, is a provision that if the buyer or any of the buyer's agents damage the property, let's say, for example, the home inspector damages the property, the buyer's on the hook for paying for those damages. Even if they terminate, they can't terminate and think they're going to get out of it. Those are the seller's consequential damages. Home inspector damages the property, buyer breaches, seller can go after buyer to get their property fixed. Additional costs. Liquidated damages, these are money damages that we agreed on when we entered into the contract. If I terminate or breach, I'm going to give you X amount. In our offer to purchase and contract, liquidated damages are awarded to the seller in the event of the buyer's breach. Buyer's not considered in breach until after due diligence. We're going to have refreshers on that conversation on that contract to closing. But the buyer's not in breach until after due diligence, because their due diligence period is their right to terminate, right? So if they terminate in due diligence, they're just exercising that right to terminate. After due diligence, now they're in breach. If the buyer breaches the seller's liquidated damages, they keep the due diligence fee, and now they get the earnest money. Those are amounts that we agreed to when we entered into the contract. And as we're going to see next weekend, the seller's liquidated damages are their sole and exclusive remedy. So listing agents, when an offer comes in for $5 due diligence and $15 earnest money, you need to have a discussion with your seller. If your buyer terminates hours before closing, Are you going to be happy with that as your liquidated damages? Because that is your sole and exclusive remedy. In this market, due diligence fees and earnest monies are insane. We're not always going to be in this market. That pendulum will swing back. Somewhere down the road, we'll be in a buyer's market again. And we're going to start seeing due diligence for $50, earnest money for $50. We're going to see those come down. The market's going to drive that. So our money damages in the event of either party's breach. Another contract remedy is something called specific performance. The non-breaching party can sue to force the other party to enforce their side of the contract. $30,000, $50,000. There's a private Facebook group. Now, there's several of them, but I saw one last week or the week before. The purchase price was $410,000. Due diligence on that home, $175,000. We all did. All y'all just grabbed your head and went like, you know, is that not insane? This is the market we're in. So specific performance, the non-breaching party is suing to force the breaching party to perform as they promised. Where we're going to see specific performance typically is the buyer suing the breaching seller. Seller's in breach, buyer takes them to court, specific performance, consequential damage, compensatory damages. And if the judge awards specific performance to the buyer, they're making the seller sell. They're making the seller performed as they promised. I'm hesitant about using words like always or never, because those are pretty strong words, right? I'm going to say it's going to be really, really, really rare for specific performance to be awarded to a breaching buyer. I'm not a judge. I'm not the court. I can't tell you there's going to be a circumstance. But I think the majority of the time, what we're going to see is the buyer suing the breaching seller for specific performance. Okay. The other contract remedy that the parties may have is rescission. You can rescind your contract. Basically, you take it back. If you put down any deposits, you get your money back. Once the contract's been rescinded, both parties go about their lives as if this contract never happened to begin with. Contract just kind of poof, disappears. It's been rescinded. Contract's invalid. Again, if you put down any deposits, you'll get your money back. It's almost like it did. Well, not almost. It is like it never happened, like it didn't happen. You guys see on your chat, you have the option. You can send everyone a message, but when you also look on your chat, you can just send me a message. So I want you guys to set your chats just to send me a message. Send me a private chat. Let's test your memory. Isn't this fun? How many days does a buyer have to rescind a contract for a timeshare? They enter into a timeshare contract. How many days does a buyer have to rescind a timeshare contract? And for a timeshare, a buyer has 5 days to rescind their contract. 5 days to rescind. That's right. 5, 5, 5, 10. 5 days to rescind a timeshare. Okay, don't worry. You get another chance. How many days does a buyer have to rescind their contract for a brand new construction condominium? How many days to rescind their contract for a new construction condominium? Hint, it's not 5. I'm in a good mood. There you go. And for a brand new construction condominium, I love the question marks. Like, are you asking me? For a brand new construction condominium, the buyer has 7 days to rescind their contract. Only new construction. Everybody hear me? This does not apply to resale. So 5 days for a timeshare, 7 days for a new construction. The buyer can take their contract back. If they put down any deposits, they'll get that money back. And both former buyer and timeshare developer go about their lives as if they never met, never encountered each other. Questions on that? Everybody good with that? I think the Amazon Prime truck is stuck in my driveway. This could be fun. He's doing like a 7-point road turn out here. I mean, I got a turnaround for him and everything. He's not, it's not hard to get out of my driveway. Here he goes. He's got it. Nope. This is fun. All right, maybe he's new driving that truck. He hasn't had much experience driving that big old Amazon truck. There we go. All right. Yeah, it was a blast from the past, wasn't it? It's been a while since you thought about timeshares and 5 days for timeshares and 7 days new construction. I think the last little piece in chapter 10, I told you 3 chapters in this whole class. We're gonna finish one of them before lunch today. Chapter 10 does talk about auction sales. Auction sales are a totally different beast than any kind of residential sale. So with auction sales, I want you guys to put auction sales in its own little separate bucket, its own little separate category. For your test, you don't need to worry about, just pretend like auction sales don't even exist unless you are specifically asked about an auction sale. Okay, it's just its own separate. Has anybody ever been to a real estate auction? A couple of you? I haven't. I want to go. I keep saying we should do a field trip one day, so maybe we. I think it'd be really interesting to just go and watch. Auction sales just work a little bit differently. So again, we're putting them in their own separate category. With an auction sale, when that gavel comes down and the auctioneer says sold, that's it, we're under contract. The auctioneer binds the seller. Obviously, once that gavel comes down, the very next step is to get that agreement in writing. But once that gavel comes down, the seller is obligated to comply. The auctioneer can bind the seller. And auction sales can be with reserve or without reserve. So an auction sale with reserve, the seller has the right to stop the bidding if they're not satisfied with how it's going. If the bids aren't high enough, if they're not pleased with the results, with reserve means that the owner has the right to say, stop, we're not doing this. Without reserve then means they get what they get. Auctioneers have 2 licenses. They have a real estate license. They have an auctioneer's license. You may go to an auction where there's a crier, the person that's actually, that guy, that's a crier. They don't need a real estate license. Was that bad? That was my impression. They don't need a real estate license, but they do need an auctioneer's license. So if the crier is not the auctioneer, The auctioneer represents the seller. They're an agent of the seller. In auctions, you're not going to have dual agency. The auctioneer isn't allowed to represent the buyer. The auctioneer will only work with the seller. Buyers are welcome to bring their own agents. Any questions or comments? Chapter 10. Just in your book to point a few things out, if you have your manual in front of you, page 317, they give you a little self-check assessment. So there's a little quiz there. If you're looking at the digital copy, just scroll all the way to the bottom. There's no pages in the digital version, but there's a little self-check assessment. Kind of see how you're doing. I got some stuff for you guys on Learn, Test, Pass as well. We didn't talk about that yet, did we? We'll talk about Learn, Test, Pass when we come back from lunch. You guys still have your chats set to just me? Just send me a chat, because I got my own self-assessment for you guys. So I'm going to put a question up on the, no, I'm going to put a couple questions up on the screen. I want you to tell me and just me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. Very good. Everybody ready? Let's see how we do. The essential element of any type of contract includes all the following except. Okay. Breathe. The essential element of any type of contract includes all the following except agency necessary element. I got your vibes. A necessary element to create a contract. It's not an essential element. Agency disclosure. Offer and acceptance. You got to have competent parties, legal consideration, legality of the object, and it's got to be in writing. Questions on this? Okay, that was fun. Let's do it again. The law requiring real estate contracts be in writing to be enforceable is the okay. Did I hear from everybody? The law that requires real estate contracts to be in writing and signed to be enforceable is our statute of frauds. Statute of frauds says, why do we sign things? Why do we put things in writing? So they'll stand up in a court of law. So they will be enforceable. Questions on this one? A contract created under duress is contract created under duress may be voidable. Ah, How many times is your first answer? Usually your gut answer is the first one. Y'all stop changing answers. Stop it. Most of the time, your first answer is going to be the right one. Stick with your gut. So under duress, remember, under duress, somebody felt threatened of violence or of harm to them or their family. They entered into the contract. Now that they're in the contract, they could, if they can claim duress, if they can claim that they were forced into the contract, the judge may make it voidable. And it's voidable because only one of the parties has the right to do. The person that held the weapon can't get out. You guys with me? It's only the person that had the weapon held to them. Does that make sense? Only one party has the right to make it voidable. And if they never go to a judge, we still have a valid contract. We could go on to closing. So who makes it voidable? The judge. It doesn't happen automatically. That party has to go and prove that they were under duress. Questions on this one? Okay. All of the following will terminate an offer, except all the following will terminate offer except an offer from a third party. Isn't this multiple offer world that we're in today? I mean, it's really uncommon not to have an offer from a third party in most of our transactions. The offeror is free to revoke their offer at any time prior to acceptance. That would terminate the offer. Death of the offeror before acceptance would terminate it. Counteroffer is a rejection, so that would terminate the offer. So what you're looking for is offer of a third party. Okay, one more, and I want you guys to take a minute and think about this. Get your scratch paper out if you have to, but just take 1 minute and think about this. A real estate contract becomes valid when? I think so. I lose count. So a real estate sales contract becomes valid when communication of acceptance is given to the offeror. The side making the offer has to know that their offer's been accepted. Remember, the offeror is the person given the offer, the giver of the offer. The offeree is the receivee. So the person making the offer must know that their offer's been accepted. A is step one, right? I have everybody signed, but I still don't have a valid contract because it's a twofold process. Getting everybody to sign is step one. Communication of acceptance to the offeror is step two. Questions or comments on that?
Julie, are you saying valid is different from enforceable?
I know, I'm saying they're the same.
Okay, because what we talked about earlier, communication of acceptance is given to the offer, doesn't say that a signed agreement has been communicated.
That's the second step, though. So A is step one, but it's not enough, is it? So I still need that second step. So
Okay,
both
so-
parties sign, you're close, but you still don't have a valid contract.
Okay, that's why I was asking, because if that B would have been extended to say, and written contract had been communicated, that's what I would have went with.
And I guess I led you to assume a little bit that if you're communicating acceptance, that's already been accepted, right? You've already signed it. So now you have to communicate that acceptance, communicate that that was signed.
Okay, yeah, because that contradicts what we were talking about earlier. In my opinion, that contradicts what we were talking about earlier, because that doesn't mean.
And I appreciate, and I know a lot of some of these tests quite like, I don't have so much room, to work with. So this is probably for those of you that know me, I generally prefer to Kahoot. The reason we don't Kahoot, you guys, this is the biggest post-licensing class I've had in about a year and a half. I think last year I maxed out at about 3 or 4 people, and I wasn't comfortable doing Kahoot with that many people. So we moved to PowerPoint, and that's why I'm here. I miss Kahoot. I may have to bring Kahoot back if I start having bigger classes. But this is very exciting for me. I'm so happy to see all of you here. This is good. Yeah, I think one class, there were like 3 of us, which is good. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to make 2 people Kahoot, So
And
that's
please,
why.
please understand that I'm not questioning you. I just want to make sure.
No,
I'm
not, and please do.
correctly.
Please do. So, and I'm saying that's my fault. I may have assumed that you were going to assume some things here. But what I want you to take away, what I want you to understand, that magic moment in time where it goes from being an offer to a contract. The last offeree accepts it, they've got to sign it, written acceptance. And then once they accept, that communication of their acceptance has to go back to the offeror. And that's the second and final step. And that's what I was trying to get to here. So thank you for that. As long as we're good, that's what I care about. Questions on this? Cool. Okay. Half a day down. We're getting there. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to stop sharing. We're all going to leave. We're all going to log out. We're going to take a break for lunch. You get 1 hour. So it's 12:24. Let's say we come back and start right back up at 1:30. So we'll give you a few extra minutes. I'll probably log on 5 minutes early so you guys can log on at 1:25 so you guys can start coming back on. But we need to get started right back at 1:30. Okay. When we come back at 1:30, I'm going to make sure you guys got Learn Test Pass. If you haven't, the email that you got from Lane yesterday that got you in this class today, it gave you the link and the instructions you need to access Learn Test Pass. So if you haven't gotten in yet, please look at that email, take those steps. We'll talk about that when we come back from lunch. I'm temporarily skipping unit 11 or chapter 11. So hang on to chapter 11. We'll come back to that. When we come back from lunch, we're going to get into chapter 14. And by getting into chapter 14 after lunch, that allows us to get to the math tomorrow. So we can start talking about our closing disclosure so you guys have time to look at it before your test next Sunday. Fair enough? Questions, comments, concerns? Everybody hungry? My husband just came home with food. So let's go eat. Everybody have a great lunch, and I'll see you back here about 1:25.